G'day legends, I hope you're having a fantastic day and so far you're having a brilliant week. Now legends, there's a lot of information, a lot of statements, a lot of speeches absolutely being belt-fed out of the UN in our direction. Now what I will say about all of this, and it's very difficult to make sense of it, is actions speak louder than words. So there's a lot of rhetoric put out there by world leaders, but look at what actually happens following. That will give you a better idea. Because if it was the opposite, if words spoke to pure power politics, we wouldn't be talking about China's rise to dominance. We wouldn't be talking about these great state power politics. We'd be talking about Estonia, Lithuania, and their global hegemony. So take a step back and wait for things to happen. And that's what a lot of our video is going to be about today, is having a further look at Trump's statement. And is Trump washing his hands with the war and saying, well, you guys can fight, we'll get paid for it. But also, what is being said about a possible Ukrainian offensive that may have swung where Trump's view of, okay, maybe Ukraine, like he said, will not only take back territory, but further on as well. And we'll talk about the reality of offensive capability. And a lot of that, we're going to look at what Mr. Valery Zaluzhnyi has said. Now, Zaluzhnyi, of course, was the chief of the armed forces and then was pushed out. One thing I'll say is he was pushed out because of his political competition, but Zaluzhnyi, love him or hate him, a lot of what he said, time has proven him to be correct, especially around mobilisation. He has written a fantastic article today. I'll show you the article if you don't make it to that point in the video, the role of innovation as the basis of a sustainable resistance strategy. Go look this up at zn.ua. It's a really open, honest reality of the battlefield. What we are seeing talks about Kursk and that the cost was not worth it, which we have spoken about from day one of that. But also he does speak about the prolonged, protracted nature, attritional nature of this war. And Zaluzhnyi himself speaking very similar to what we speak about. And we'll overlay that with some of the doctrine that we show you and what he is talking about as well, as someone who is very knowledgeable on Russian or Soviet Ukraine tactics as well, working within NATO now too. So that's a really, really important part. Of course, we'll be looking at the maps, comparing maps or bits and pieces. Where I'll start is with this. Of course, these FAB glide bombs, these cause massive chaos, not only in a tactical sense, but in a strategic sense as well. Of course, we can see these slung under a Russian Su-34. What we can see is these back winglets on these here. Now, this is a new addition to these. I may be late to the party, but it's the first time I've been hearing about these. You can see this part at the back of the weapon system here. Now, this is the same system, but it does do a 180-degree turn when it falls off the rails of the plane. Now, the dual wing, they're saying, has increased the range, giving slightly more lift, increasing that glide. Some say around 50%. Again, with any gravity weapon, there's so many factors that play into the actual range of this, the height, the speed of the plane, even just weather as well. And this goes into a lot when we speak about even not only glide weapons, but down to like missile systems, the given ranges. This is always under Volkswagen vehicle type scenarios of fuel economy. When this can hit a plane or this at this run of range, that is in perfect weather conditions, the plane facing, if it's heat seeking, away, so it's the hottest part, all of these as well. But we do see those FABs working sometimes out to around 90 kilometers, but well within that also all day, every day, and they cause huge, huge issues. And this is basically, as I put it, a very heavy artillery system as part of that hold, destroy, and exploit a tactic that the Russians are using. There's a link to that. I'll put it below because Zaluzhnyi talks directly about exactly what we have spoken about this Russian tactics of using artillery and drones all as one to hold these DRGs, but as well trying to reintroduce maneuver, exactly what we spoke about in that video. Now, let's move into the political space a little bit and talk about the UN and Trump, and where I don't think I was incorrect yesterday, but I probably didn't go as far into what I should have also, and there's a good article about Trump washing his hands with this today. So the SJW, or WSJ if you will, has had this article saying how Zelensky's charm offensive reversed Trump's skepticism on Ukraine. And it talks about, of course, the blow up in the Oval Office to now where we see Trump doing a 180-degree turn and saying, well, I think Ukraine, with the support of the EU, is in a position to fight and win all of Ukraine back in its original form. Why not? And I made comment on this, that I believe this is a sort of last-ditch effort to show Putin we're going to go all in unless you come to the table. But what we do know is with all of this, the negotiations, I think they are dead and buried, that we will see fighting to the conclusion of this war. And as we spoke about, the battlefield then codifying the reality of the political settlement that will come at the end. But I got a lot of criticism, which is good because it helps open my eyes to bits and pieces where I have missed. Please continue that. This is an open conversation. A lot of people saying, Willie, I think that you're wrong. Trump's basically saying, Ukraine, if you want to fight, Zelensky, if you want to fight, go for it. Keep fighting. But we're not going to be funding it, but we are going to be getting paid from this. Now, US officials, they have said that Trump issued the statement in part to pressure Russian President Putin to make a deal since no progress is being made. That's sort of in line with what we spoke about yesterday. But the verbal shift from Trump came amid Russia's continued failure to make significant gains on the battlefield, the slowdown in the economy. Yes, there is a slowdown in the economy, still performing better than a hell of a lot of economies around the world. But the significant gains, that comes in kilometre squares. That is how that is being presented as well, which we've said that can skew the vision of an attritional nature of war. As we've said, you could lose ground you could never gain a single square inch and still actually be winning an attritional war. Now, we look at this, and this is something we spoke about yesterday. They being Zelensky and Keith Kellogg, and Keith Kellogg, he is drinking the Kool-Aid by the fucking gallon of this, have updated Trump on the current battlefield conditions. Now, this is one of those things that we spoke about. Of course, we spoke yesterday that Trump saying in his UN speech, I only found out 2 weeks ago NATO was buying Russian energy. I seriously question, I know this sounds so ridiculous, at what is actually being presented to Trump in the information or intelligence sphere. It also says Trump was made aware of a planned Ukrainian offensive which would require US intelligence support. Now, what we do know is the US intelligence support cannot be replaced by Europe, not even close to. I know people, there's this system. It's not even close to the amount of the ISR satellite, all of this that the US has. This is incredibly important here. But a planned Ukrainian offensive, and what Trump is saying, not only take back all these occupied areas and Crimea and pushing into Russia, the size of this offensive would be absolutely massive. We saw, and we're going to go over Zaluzhnyi speaking about what happened in 2023. That was the best morale Ukrainian forces and training was going to have. And we saw what happened around Robotny or the Kyiv front. And then, of course, in Kursk. So again, this planned offensive, Ukraine can't stabilize the line at the moment. It's continually in free fall, moving to the west. So again, it goes into what is actually being presented to Trump. Officials say that Trump only made a rhetorical shift, not a policy shift. And like we spoke about at the beginning, actions speak louder than words, probably something that we missed. But I was speaking about after the disastrous meeting that Zelensky has managed to sort of smarten up, tighten up his presentation to Trump, not only in his attire, but also in the way for America expenditure on the war to bring him back on side. Zelensky saying that Trump clearly understands the situation, is well informed about all aspects of the war. Again, Trump saying, I found out 2 weeks ago NATO was buying Russian energy. It doesn't fill me with confidence. Now, in this, Trump has so far proved unwilling to impose significant sanctions on Russia despite making threats to do so, and will provide the surge of weapons that Ukraine would need to retake significant territory to protect its cities. Now, the amount of surge of weapons to retake territory would be far greater than we have seen throughout the whole war so far. But that is only a very small part of the picture. The larger part of the picture is the ability to recruit and mobilize in the hundreds of thousands to man those weapons, because you can just pump in weapons and it won't do any good if you do not have the manpower to be on the back end of that system. And that is the primary issue. You could pump in $150 billion right now in weapon systems. Manpower will remain a massive critical issue. And that manpower is going to take years, if possible at all, to actually solve through training pipelines to be able to go on then offensive actions. Let's go a little bit further. Now, Kremlin spokesman said, of course, that Russia will have an opportunity to speak to the White House, and Zelensky has urged representatives of these nations to condemn Russia if it keeps dragging this war on. And if Russia is left unchecked, Moscow would aim to widen its ambitions in Europe, and that Ukraine is only the first. Now, again, this is Russophrenia 101, where Russia is on the verge of collapse and the verge of dominance simultaneously, or as we call it, Schrodinger's Russia. That saying, well, Ukraine's planning an offensive and Russia is making no significant ground, but at the same time, simultaneously, Russia is on the verge of marching into Berlin again. And this is where this doesn't just add up. But this unchecked, there's two problems in this. Left unchecked, we are seeing where Russia is moving and where some powers may increase. But if left isolated for the US, this is the seesaw of great power politics, where there's always a pro and a con. If Russia is left isolated by the US, the more powerful China can become with access to incredibly cheap resources and certain bits of technology and this de-Washingtonization, if you will, that many countries are on at the moment. Opposition lawmaker in Ukraine has said on social media that Trump's words, they don't mean anything and wouldn't have any consequence. So what have we actually seen happen? And this article here, I think, sums up the bits that I missed yesterday, that Trump is washing his hands of the Ukraine war. What may appear at first glance as a stunning U-turn may actually be bad news for Volodymyr Zelensky. That look beyond the headlines. And the statement is a lesson in messaging. Rather than pledging a fresh support to Ukraine or loading up action on Russia, Trump appears to be handing things over to Europe and NATO. There is no suggestion of extra support to Ukraine or that he will punish Moscow further. His only commitment is to keep selling weapons to allies. This is hardly the word game changer. After staking so much of its reputation to bring Putin to Alaska for talks and putting himself at the heart of negotiations, Trump has learned a difficult lesson. Ending a war is hard. It sounds as if he may have had enough. And I do agree with how Mr. Rob Crilly has worded this in here. It does look like Trump is going, you can fight and you can pay us for it. As we do see this diversion away from where the European liberal states and where America is moving. But America, they want to monetize this as much as possible. And there is a win-win in this. If Europe needs another few $100 billion worth of weapons that they're going to be purchasing, and there's going to be a lot of loans from the US as well, we've seen where Europe has cut off energy from Russia as well. And we've spoken about the balance of sovereignty. And if you're reliant on America for security and energy and trade, your balance of sovereignty is heavily into one singular state. And we see on Fox News today, Energy Secretary of the US, Chris Wright, saying this.
They are taking action in Europe to displace Russian energy, maybe not as fast as we'd like. America stands ready today to displace all of the Russian gas that goes into Europe and all of the Russian refined products from oil as well. So I spent 6 days.
So the US stands ready to replace all of the gas, all of the refined products of oil, again, with everything, follow the money. Now, let's have a look at the map, see where things are shifting. So, of course, we have Ukraine at the center of your screen. The capital key, the red areas occupies the 22, the purple since 2014. When we have these two arrows on the red check that we will see today, this gives us where Russia has moved over the past 24 hours. Now, where we're going to start is down in the Velikonosilka area. And finally, I'm seeing some of the most delusional bloggers or analysts, if you want to call them, speaking about how this is of concern because this area has been in freefall. And we can see Kalinivsky. This is further coming under control. Many are saying occupy. We actually looked at Russian flags go up there the other day. Further movement around Novoanka and Ternove front, but there's a healthy dose of grey zone in this front line. Now, we'll have a look at this and compare in the future, but what I want to show you in here and what people are finally starting to notice is we go onto a map like Mr. Play For Us here is the fortifications that sit in here. So to give you an idea, this is Kalinivsky. This is Kalinivsky, just to line up, give you an idea. And what I'm seeing even the most Kool-Aid drinker saying today is, hey, this looks like it's in behind fortifications, and the fortifications in here, these were to block east to west, but then now they are blocked north to south now that this has moved. There's not much stopping this in here, and we could see this continual shift in behind a lot of these lines in the direction of Dobropilia Mark II, which is further in the direction of Zaporizhia long term. And these fortifications maps give you a very clear picture of where there's pushing and why there is kilometre square success in this area. Now, let's push up and then come into Pokrovsk, of course, where this pocket has formed. Now, let's firstly look around here around Muravkia Udashne. So again, this is probably Novopavlivkia front, but and pocket that has developed, but easier for my own labeling of things. There has been then the Russian army completely seized Muravka. At the end of August, Ukrainian army infiltrated from the Solona River and entered the settlers of the locality. It remains divided. So around then Muravka, Novomayalivkia front line that Russia occupies this area, but then Ukraine's occupying from the north down to the south around Novomayalivkia as well. So some changes around here. Now, come up into Pokrovsk itself, and we're going to look at the Pokrovsk eastern area. Now, firstly, let's look at Suryak, and then we'll look at Mr. Thorkill. So showing a lot of combats on the western side of this and further pushing down into this pocket of the Ukrainian forces as well, reaching down to these areas of Mayak. What I will say is Deep State is completely ignoring this area at the moment. Now, what I've said is I believe the blogger who is following this the best is Mr. Thorkill. Now, I can't find a contact for himself, but if someone could get us in touch, that would be greatly appreciated. So he speaks about the situation in this Drozhkivka axis. So this whole axis, this is this Popov Yar to Druzhkivka axis up here and Volodymyvkia too. Again, the translation from Polish to English can be a bit shit. But below, marked on the map, will show you the approximate location of craters dropped by Russian aviation of these FABs. And this is all around this Shakovka, Sofivkia area where these are being dropped. But let's have a look at this map, because this map is showing far different to where the Deep State is. So this is Sofivkia in here. It can be actually difficult to line these up because of how different it is. And he's showing the Russian forces are well out past this reservoir at the moment and in line basically with Sofivkia. So if Mr. Thorkill is correct by this, he's talking right into here, say some 5 kilometres back. And remember, he has been very reliable on this front and sort of raising the flag of warning, going, this pocket in here forming, this is turning badly quickly. And you can see where these FAB craters are landing and where these pushes are happening. There's clearly a visible shift of the tactical bombing zone of the Russian aviation to the north, as shown on the map, indicates the progress of Russian units in the Volodymyvkia, Novopavlivkia area up in here. In this direction, red lines with arrows show likely axes of Russian offensive actions. That by cutting off the Volodymyvkia-Druzhkivka road, which they're sitting out in here, and again, this road that leads right down from Druzhkivka into this pocket, and how that would be very critical. Now, it's being suggested these assaults are being carried out by dismounted assault groups of 3 to 4 soldiers. We've spoken about that at length. There's a link down below to hear me speak about it more at length, but we'll also hear Zaluzhnyi speak about how that is operating. But according to him, that this front line is looking significantly more like this at the moment, and that gives us a very different picture of how this is looking. And this is what we said yesterday, that the Ukrainians are definitely having some success down into Mayak-Pankivkia area, and likely some around the Boykivkia area as well, so down into here. But if the Russians can get and cut this road and force a withdrawal out of here, that in turn fixes doesn't fix the situation, but improves the situation for their units just to the west of that. So let's have a further look at the maps. We'll move up into the Terny sector, of course. We have Seversk, where we have Zaluzhnyi, Terny, and Chandrilahove areas. I'm sure you're familiar with if you watch any of my videos in here. Now, further movements inside the localities of Novoselivska and Derelove. So this is right out in here. Now, Derelove, the labeling on this sucks, but this is Novoselivska and Derelove. So further movements out in this direction, as we've spoken about, that makes complete sense for where the Russians are trying to desaturate then fires as well. And then further movements, he says, around Zaluzhnyi, Kolodiaz. So further movement in the bottom of here. So you can see where Zaluzhnyi is sitting, the control in here, and Kolodiaz as well. So further just pushing on this. And this does two things. It increases the pressure around, of course, this movement into Borova, but also the flank of Seversk, and build that flank in the direction of Yampil and eventually Slovyansk, Kramatorsk. Now let's move right up into the north. Now we see this area up here, of course, this Odradne front line, Milove. Now, this is where these maps are showing vastly different. What we have seen is by Suryak that around Odradne that Russians have made advances not only into this sector, but have exploited all the way from here down through Milove, of course, up in the Kharkiv Oblast. Then we'll go to the absolute opposite extreme, down into the south around the Kamyanskaya-Stepnohursk front. No movement being shown for some time on this, but he says on this front, during the last 6 days, the Russian army entered the western part of Stepnohursk. So you can see right up through into sort of where my cursor is at the moment. That is at least what Suryak is claiming. So the kilometre squares the next month are going to be a little bit less, and I've said that this is likely going to be the case with how we are seeing the layout of these pockets forming, but there will be exploitation around some of these fortification lines in Velika, potentially in the north, potentially in the south. Keep an eye on a lot of this. Now, Zaluzhnyi, this article that we I showed you in the beginning, you should go and have a read of this. It'll take you 10 minutes to read, but I think it's really, really worth it. Now, do I agree with everything in this? No, you shouldn't ever agree with everything. If you're reading or listening to things you only ever agree with, that is a huge problem. You've moved yourself into an echo chamber. But let's have a look at some of this here. Now, he speaks about the minimum level of armament of the created military units, which depended entirely on the vision and capability of our partners, is insufficient and sometimes absent. And this was talking about the 2023 counter-offensive that occurred, that the vision, the capability given, it was entirely reliant on our partners, but it was absolutely not what we needed. Now, in my opinion, if Ukraine was to improve something massively for themselves, would be getting Zaluzhnyi back. He really understands the reality of the situation. He understands better than a lot of people I've seen on here the Russian Soviet tactics, what is actually being used well, and he gets a lot of criticism for this. The problem is he's a massive threat politically to Zelensky, and he's not a Western yes man either. But this is where someone said to me, yeah, but this could be that by the end of this, however this war ends up, Zelensky's sort of thrown under the bus, and then Zaluzhnyi is moved in and the blame is shifted away. We'll see. Speaking about this offensive and the vision and the capability of the partners, all this led to a lack of such necessary trained reserves for conducting large-scale manoeuvre offensives and operations. As a result, to the transition to predominantly positional combat operations in all areas of the offensive. On the enemy side, of course, there was extensive defensive lines, multi-layered and highly developed in engineering terms. So there wasn't enough to actually conduct this. There wasn't the reserves to do this, and those defensive lines which barely pushed in. However, the decisive factor was the high effectiveness of the UAV, initially as a means of aerial reconnaissance at the tactical level, which gave the enemy the opportunity to detect and concentration of our armoured vehicles and manpower in real time and transfer reserves to the expected directions of our strikes. So because they had such a level of ISR from UAVs that we weren't able to sort of get the jump on them, that they could move reserves before we could actually move our armoured vehicles or our military offensive actions into these fronts. This is very similar to the gentleman, remember, when Kursk happened and he was in Kursk and he said to me, we got spotted straight off the bat, and that is when it sort of all went to shit. And that was on day one, which he proved to be very correct in. And I like people say, he was literally there with the Ukrainian forces moving through. But we've seen that 2 times. This also led then to high targeting efficiency for both high precision strikes by enemy missile and artillery, which was achieved precisely through the widespread use of reconnaissance UAVs and tactical command chain to detect our actions and adjust fire. So not only being able to visibly see it and move forces, but then also high level targeting of equipment too. Reconnaissance UAVs in the front demonstrated that it is possible to conduct reconnaissance from the air almost 24 hours a day. Now, in the same way, in the future, having the appropriate forces and means, we acted. Thus, conditions were created for the inevitable detection of any concentration of strike groups, both in the area of the combat line and in the rear. All of this then revealed location of reserves and made it easy to determine the directions of strikes, so it became practically impossible to achieve the factor of surprise of the strike when breaking through defensive lines. That so much was hit before even reaching there. Now, although, of course, I can object, recalling the same Kursk offensive, of course, that he was not in charge of, he'd been pushed out before then. I'd love to sit down with him over a beer when there's no microphones on and actually see what he thinks of Kursk, if he's willing to say this publicly. Of course, such actions, if they are justified primarily by human losses with limited goals, can be carried out. However, practice has shown that in the end, an isolated tactical breakthrough on a narrow section of front does not bring the necessary success to the attacking side. The defending troops managed to take advantage of both technological and tactical advantages, and over time, not only did not allow a tactical breakthrough to develop into an operational success, but later they themselves carried out a tactical advance also without operational success. The price of such actions is unknown to me, but it's obvious that it was too high. And in Kursk itself, the geolocated confirmed losses of armoured vehicles is more for Ukraine than it is for Russia. You don't hear about that much, but that is true, objectively true. And if you subjectively, you look at the footage that came out of there and the fibre optic introduction of drones and this and that, the cost of Kursk was massive for Ukraine's best forces at the time. But look at this, narrow section of the front line to bring necessary success into the attacking side, that it's unjustified cost high. This is in some of the exact attritional art of war doctrine lessons that you and I have spoken about. Now, during the period where you are recuperating forces and moving to try and get into more of a protraction, attritional nature of war, major offensive operations should be avoided. Even if the large attacks are successful, which Kursk in the initial was successful, they will result in significant casualties, often for meaningless territorial gains. When did you see this? You saw this on my video in the opening of Kursk, that even if it is successful, often it will have meaningless territorial gains and it will result in significant casualties. An army should never accept a battle on unfavourable terms. In attritional war, any terrain that does not have vital industrial centre is irrelevant. It is always better to retreat and preserve forces regardless of political consequence. This is the problem with having your centre of gravity, your Schwerpunkt, outside of Ukraine. Russia's centre of military gravity is in Moscow. It's with the command, it's with the companies, it's with Putin. The problem with Ukraine's is it doesn't sit with Zelensky. The centre of gravity of military power sits actually in the Western support and ability to fund. So therefore, it's more attractive to have offensive actions that have political vision to try and increase support more so than just tactical success, achieving operational success, achieving strategic success. Fighting on disadvantageous terrain burns up units, losing experienced soldiers who are the key to victory. And again, this is what we saw in Kursk, where we saw then the East move quicker, and since then, offensive operations be severely limited. Now, Zaluzhnyi continues. Now, again, we are going through not all of this, so you should go and read it. I'll repeat that on the basis of positional deadlock lies not only with the impossibility of breaking through defensive lines, but most importantly, the impossibility of completing operational tasks, including entering the operational space. So, due to the amount of drones in the air, to actually carry out just operational tasks of rotation, all of this is so difficult. Where I do disagree with Zaluzhnyi is that he says that there's an operational or positional deadlock on the front line, which I do not agree with. Now, some areas maybe, but we are seeing from Velika to the south to the north to the east, we are seeing that move. That doesn't scream positional deadlock to myself. Previous large-scale military conflicts in the 21st century in Syria, Iraq, Libya, and other countries did not lead to a positional stalemate. It's happened for two reasons. Defeat of the enemy forces was achieved mainly by remote airstrikes and high-precision weapons. I disagree with that. We haven't seen a defeat of the enemy forces over a long period of time in these conflicts, and I think many people massively overestimate strategic remote airstrikes, but it can, of course, be a battlefield multiplier of action too. But I think more with this. Secondly, there was a confrontation between high-tech armed forces, for example, the armed forces of US and NATO countries, and a deliberately weaker enemy, often scattered by the remnants of an organised army, still one of the Soviet model or partisan formations. And yes, to compare the power indifference between Ukraine, backed by all of NATO, and then Russia, to America and allies moving into Iraq is very a different weighting. In Russia's war against Ukraine, for the first time in the 21st century, there's a confrontation between two, thanks to our partners, high-tech armed forces, approximately equal in their combat capabilities, although different in size and resources. So you could nitpick in this, but again, what I want to pull out of this is confrontation between these partners. This is something that we have seen very new. And if you look at even a middling power can lock a great state or a larger state into a protracted war. I spoke about this with Pakistan, India. On paper, there's a massive power difference. But if it was a ground war, conventionally, I have no doubt that Pakistan could actually lock India into a protracted war. Over time, size and resource you will pay the piper, and that will become more and more weighted over the protraction of the war. But to lock into years of war, smaller powers can do this, especially with these high-tech weapons like drones and stuff that have entered the fold over time. But again, there's a lot of predictions made around this war without any case study of this war. So, for example, where there was misjudgment from the Kremlin to Washington about how quickly Russia could take over Ukraine, but there's no case study that exists that is to work off. It's all assumptions. Have we seen a war where there is high-end, top-of-the-line air defense and fighter aircraft and drones and all of these working? No, we haven't. So when there was the misjudgment by the Kremlin of the invasion, the misjudgment by Washington on the 3 days, and the misjudgment even in Ukraine of the ability to actually be able to slow down the Russians, especially in these opening years, a lot of this was done off assumptions of power rather than actually seeing it. And I've spoken at length about the Yemenis and the US unable to gain full air superiority over this area of the world as well. So again, this is the case study of high intensity, high tech warfare, but this is the first one too. So it's very difficult to try and extrapolate how things should be looking. The experience of our war shows that precision-guided missiles are being used up rapidly. Large-scale air operations are being constrained by air defence systems. Yes. As leading the world in 23, as World War II played a classic large-scale ground operations. Now, this is what I focus on, is NATO's biggest weakness by a fucking mile is mass. That these guided missiles being used up very quickly. That is having, strikes, but if and I often say, you need to apply this the same way. If you think that the Ukrainian drones and missiles, strategic strikes are going to have a decisive effect, look at the imbalance in the beginning of the war for the Russian missiles and drones, and there wasn't a decisive effect. So you need to apply this equally as well. But this mass, this is where people say, if China can just survive the first few days of the war, this mass and the use up of precision-guided weapons will just be used. Now, again, this assumption of air superiority that, constrained by air defense systems, newer air defense systems are incredibly efficient, incredibly effective. Now, again, this is one of those assumptions that took place not only in Moscow, but in Washington around the assumption, I believe, of air superiority or localized that the US thought Russia would have, Russia, I believe, thought they would have, Ukraine believed that Russians would have. But again, this is the first time we've seen this go actually into contest too. And the US and many NATO countries, they're assuming that if they enter a war, that they assume they're going to have air superiority. In my opinion, this is a completely fatal assumption to make. This concept of large-scale ground operations hit hard with another problem that needed to be solved: mobilization. And this goes into this whole idea, and why Zaluzhnyi was probably ultimately pushed out the door was him saying, we need 500,000 more men. Today, the general picture of combat operations is based on the fact that large concentration of people, even in defence, is absolutely impossible. Any increase in the number of personnel in positions will instantly lead to their destruction by FPV or artillery strikes, which is supplemented by UAV. So, of course, you're just more efficient with these. But if you have an increase in personnel in a position, it's easy to see it will be destroyed, and this is a huge problem. Now, he speaks about Sloviansk, Izium, Sloviansk, this route, these are being in the zone of precise damage and is constantly expanding. It's clear that this leads not to only destruction of logistics routes, but the gradual disappearance of such concept of the rear, so that their rear within, say, 40 kilometres, and a lot of this is being destroyed. You can't have concentration of forces. Logistics are being massively inhibited to move, but also that this area is expanding with the increase in range of these drones. One thing I'll say, though, is that Ukraine hasn't learnt to not put concentrations of forces training right near the front line, as we see Iskander strikes again and again and again. Traditional placement in battle formations at less than a distance of 40 kilometres is no longer possible due to constant enemy fire control. As a result, defence is gradually transferring from active holding positions, acting in cooperation with second echelons and reserves, and firepower, to the survival of small groups, which are constantly pressured by both remote reconnaissance and attack means, and falling asleep by small groups of infantry. So it's becoming more of a porous, independent, initiative-driven front line rather than traditionally what we would see. Below, my video on Russia's tactic that they have developed of this whole destroy, exploit with FABs, drones, and DRGs. Watch that, because this breaks down very quickly what Zaluzhnyi is talking about there. As a result, such defence structure leads to the blurring of the seemingly continuous front line, and sometimes to an actual misunderstanding of the real delineation of their positions along defence lines. So the Russians invented another solution to overcome the positional angle, so-called the infiltration and the penetration of individual servicemen, DRG, and groups of enemy infantry deep into their offensive through gaps in the battle formations. We clearly saw all this on the example of Dobropilya, Salient, Pokrovska, and now Kupiansk, exactly in here, exactly what we did see. Sooner or later, taking into account the possibility of blocking our logistics and the help of UAV, this leads to a loss of positions by our units. This undoubtedly leads to a change in configuration of the contact line and creates a threat of approaching other positions. And thus, thanks to the mentioned tactic of filling our positions with a large number of assaults by small groups, the front is constantly moving, unfortunately, in our direction. So this tactic is working, and it is moving in Ukraine's direction. By the way, the levelling of the front, the return of lost positions, is taking place at the expense of the small assault units in exactly the same way, as a result of which there is a natural erasure of these units that is the expected result described above without the prospects of a deep breakthrough. So we do say attritional war, you have to accept large losses, and this is the thing, is it has to be at least sustainable for you, or unsustainable for the enemy, or more unsustainable for them. Another aspect that should deter such actions is the mandatory timely detection of the enemy and timely response of firepower, precisely thanks to UAVs. However, already now the launch sites and operators themselves have become priority targets. So Rubicon, Russia's like special forces drone operators, they are specifically going after drone operators to try and cut down on this kill chain of Ukrainian traditional artillery sources. Summing up the events unfolding on the battlefield, we can state that the positional deadlock does indeed exist. It is a characteristic feature, but there is a steady tendency to break out of it from Russia, or this reintroduction of manoeuvre that I go over in that video. Presumably, until a way is found to get out of this corner, having enough human resources to fall asleep, our positions and infiltration, Russia will continue to physically exhaust our troops, combining operations with the task of maximum losses. In its strategy of a war of attrition, such defeats are deliberately allowed. And this is the thing, is Russia has accepted there's going to be losses doing this, but they just want to have that balance of attrition. In attritional war, you accept you're going to have large losses. But this is why you pick up your conscription or your mobilisation or your recruitment, to be able to sustain that as well and trying to just have a better loss ratio. Remember, attrition, you're both attriting. You're just trying to attrit slower than your enemy. Combat operations are designed to ensure a level of losses that become unacceptable for us. As a result, such systemic depletion of forces and resources will sooner or later result in a complete burnout of the defending forces. Russia also sees a possible way out of the impasse on the battlefield in the clearing of the near sky, which use tactical level UAVs. So UAVs, Rubicon, electronic warfare, that near sky, that will be further cleared. But this right here, systemic depletion of forces, sooner or later result in complete burnout. Sounds very familiar to our theory of bankruptcy in attritional war, that eventually things fall off a cliff. All the above motivates us, first of all, to look for ways to counter the tactical level UAVs. And my bit where I would criticise and push back on Zaluzhnyi is too much into the drone unmanned space rather than that infantry is still king of the battlefield, along with your traditional artillery forces. But again, he's looking at this going, yeah, but we're not going to have the manpower. We have to try and push on that. In fact, death, injury, mental breakdown are an inevitable consequence of a long stay on the front line in modern conditions. This is today's reality, which is known to both those who stubbornly evade mobilisation and those who yesterday hunted for Shaheed, so in air defence, and today await their fate or at the front line reserve battalion. So, of course, air defence now moving that again to evading this mobilisation, conscription, all of this. But that Zaluzhnyi was originally pushed out for. This has led to what we see at the moment. It must be stated the lack of technology and the current level of developments of unmanned autonomous systems do not yet allow replacing humans at any scale on the battlefield. And this is what many people push on. I think Zaluzhnyi goes a little bit in this in the article too, though. He's trying to replace humans at the front line, but he does accept that at this point in time, that technology does not exist. The storming tactics imposed on us will require the presence of trained personnel in positions. That at the end of the day, you still need a person in the position who can rest, who can sleep, who can eat, who can shit. And what Russia's trying to do is just maintain that pressure. And this is what we've spoken about at length. At the end of the day, attritional war is a war of pressure. It is pressure on the front lines until things collapse. It's pressure politically until things collapse. It's pressure from tactics to success, to operational, to strategy, to politics. All attritional warfare is far more what's the word I'm looking for? Traditional warfare is far more holistic in its approach to total overall warfare from the individual soldier to the president, rather than these wars of individual battles that are like a war against insurgents. Anyway, legends, I hope that you have a fantastic day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.